trong prok kalian trong bóng anh tàu rong non Smot mở ti than đây nào tua tông nua lo. In this story, which recalls that of a woman at the time of the Buddha by the name of Niang Pattajara, or Pattajara, who was born into a wealthy family, but fell in love with a man of a lower caste, and then eloped with him and ran away. And a few years later, she was pregnant with her first child. And according to tradition, she wanted to go back to give birth at the home of her parents. But her husband was afraid that if they were to go back, that he would be imprisoned and tortured for being of a lower caste. And so, but she was so resolved that she went out against her husband's wishes and set out towards home. But as she got only halfway there, she felt the pangs of labor, and there gave birth alone to her first child. And so she then walked back to her husband, and they lived together for a few more years before she became pregnant with her second child. And again, she was so determined to go back. And this time, she convinced her husband to go with her. And they began to make the long journey back to her parents' homeland. But again, as they were halfway through, a great storm began to brew, and she felt the pangs of labor and knew that she would not be able to make it all the way there without first giving birth. And so she asked her husband to go to the jungle and begin to cut down some shrubs, some trees, in order to build a quiet place such that she could give birth in the shelter from the rain. And there, as her husband went off to find some wood, no sooner than he had done that, a snake came and bit him, and he passed away. And so, again, Pattajara was alone, this time with her older child, then only a couple years old, to give birth to her second baby. And then she knew, after the loss of her husband, that she must make her way back to the city. And she set off with her newborn babe and her older child. And they came to the river that they must cross, and it had flooded. And she found that she could not cross it carrying both of her children at the same time. So she had to leave her older child on the shore and first carrying across her younger babe. But as she approached the middle of the river, a great eagle swooped down and stole away her younger child. And at this, she screamed out in anguish at the loss of both her husband and her first child, and her second child, excuse me. And her first child, hearing this, thought that his mother was drowning, and so leapt into the river to help her. But he was not old enough to swim, and too was swept away. And so Pattajara, beset with grief, finally made her way back to the city. But upon arriving, found that in the great storm, that her parents' house had fallen down and had crushed her parents and her brother. And at this, Pattajara lost her mind. She could not bear the grief and wandered the streets naked and disheveled, until one day she came across a grove where the Buddha was teaching to an assembly of monks. And she walked up, naked, disheveled as she was, and sat down in front of the Buddha. And the Buddha saw her and listened. And after hearing of her tragedy, of her story, the Buddha encouraged her to look into the nature of impermanence, the nature of how all things change. And in that moment, she saw that so clearly And she became a great teacher, a great nun in that tradition, and is widely remembered for her discipline and her wisdom. And this is the story that my teacher shared with me to describe his experience under the Khmer Rouge. That this Dharma song allowed him to come to terms with that much loss in his family and in his life. Niang kat tha bao chnang mien hai ta wai tục lum ba khlang nang cô áo phai nè tra so srak sao ul ak tai mnak ai Param krang mien krua krup tup pum ba. And as much as these Dharma songs connect to our mourning, to our grief, there is also the tradition of healing, the tradition of going beyond grief, going beyond lamentation, going beyond life and death. And my teachers spoke often of the power of these songs during the time when someone is making the transition from life into death, to calm their mind, to come to a place of peace, and in some cases, to be healed. Perhaps even to live another 3, 5, 10 years. And it is through the cultivation of an experience called samvega, or samveg, which is a spiritual quaking. The experience we have when we see how strange and impermanent and short this life is. And in that realization, there's a great clarity in letting go. And this is a Dharma song which recounts the story of the Buddha on his deathbed speaking to his closest disciple, Ananda.